Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organisers and to John for the opportunity to come and tell you a little bit more about NMITE. Some of you will have heard us before, and I can give you an update and a little bit more information on what our vision is and what we think we add to the engineering education landscape. So NMITE has to be understood, I think, in the context in which it operates. So New Model Institute in Technology and Engineering, and we are an engineering specialist higher education institute in what is described as a higher education cold spot. So in our, it is certainly in our county, and there is no higher education provision to speak of, and there is very little in neighbouring counties. And so all of the young people that are in the county, if they want a higher education experience, they have to leave the county and go somewhere else. And of course, often that means that they don't return. And so the average age of people in Herefordshire is higher than in other places that it is in England and Wales. I think it's the second highest average age of county. And it's actually quite sparsely populated. It's something like the second or third most sparsely populated county in England. So we are towards the west of England, very close to the border with Wales. So a very long history of fighting with Wales and making food. That's basically what happens in Herefordshire. So we launched this week after a fairly substantial development period, and our first learners will be starting in March 2021. So we completed our validation process last week and basically launched in a much more open way to the world this week, and we're all very relieved about that. And as a greenfield university, we are building an infrastructure around us as we go, and I can't tell you how much of my job this entails, and also what a challenge it is when you come from other parts of the higher education sector and you're used to having all of that infrastructure around you, to have to build that as you go through the process of building your student cohorts and having enough in place to get validated as an institution, but also needing to develop that alongside students and alongside the community in future is quite a big, it sort of affects the NMITE culture quite significantly. We have an extremely strong place-based mission, and it's been making me reflect as I've listened to some of the preceding conversations and on earlier in the week, thinking about I think it's becoming quite radical in engineering education to say that you have a place-based mission, because we're often so much about the global now, which is quite right, and engineering happens in a global context, and that's one of the great opportunities of an engineering education. But also there is this tension with needing to be integrated into the place that you're in, and I think Iron Range were talking about that earlier in the week, about revitalizing their place-based mission. I hope I'm not misrepresenting that, and that's very much where we are too. And so the NMITE came out of advocacy from its founders, who are all local. Its political representative has been a great advocate for having a HE institution in the city, and so that means that the curriculum that we have is networked extensively into local businesses, and the community is an explicit partner that's separate to business. So often we conflate these two things together. At NMITE, we talk to both of those communities and are concerned with keeping them distinct. So we understand that the industrial mission can overlap with, but can also be separate to the community-based mission. So we're a teaching specialist university across a whole spectrum of courses and engagement modes that I'll come to. But when you are here in order to help regenerate a county and a city, it's not that easy just to say, well, we do the education part, because when you're talking about reskilling, upskilling, building back better, which is a lot of the kind of language that's used around here, then often that means things like demonstrator technologies and helping people absorb more technologies. And so you really rapidly get pulled into an applied research demonstrator space. And so that's quite an interesting part of how our mission is evolving in order to meet the vision that we originally set out. So our strategic impacts, in summary, for learners are for learners with diverse backgrounds and experience, so that they can enter higher education to study engineering, and on graduation can add value immediately. So we talk a lot about work-ready engineers. I think we all talk about that quite a lot. We all have our own understanding of what that looks like. We think that we can substantiate what that means and how we've designed our curriculum to enable graduates to start adding value straight away. And in our first partnerships group a couple of months ago, we were talking to a recruiter who was on the panel, and she was saying that it's quite interesting from her perspective how engineering graduates often have these very extended graduate schemes that you don't get in a lot of other sectors, because it's actually quite difficult for them to start creating value immediately, and they have to have these long periods of induction and mobilization. And I'm sure a lot of people will recognize that. And so actually, you know, what can our universities and higher education institutes be doing in order to reduce that transition time, so that the graduates that we help develop and produce can hit the ground running more quickly. We want to have an impact on employers who can recruit work-ready, talented and diverse engineers and access local study options to support productivity. We want Herefordshire to have a more diverse and more highly skilled population who can contribute to its health and wealth. And finally, to demonstrate different ways of doing things in higher education through scalable pedagogies, reconceptualize value for money, and synergistic pathways, by which I mean, how do you get your degree apprentices to work with your undergraduates, and how do they work with your lifelong learners and your executive education? Where are the touch points? How do they add value to one another? And can we think of those as one community rather than different learner communities, all in an aim to develop and support work-ready engineers? So what's different about us? So we have made our design decisions around the idea of work-ready graduates who are very comfortable with self-mobilization and action, and this comes from a problem-based learning curriculum. We want graduates who are very comfortable with subjectivity and the qualitative, and that comes from a heavy, I say heavy, that's a comparative statement, isn't it? A meaningful and substantial amount of liberal arts in the curriculum, and the ability to integrate across engineering and other disciplines in order to look at a problem and say, what do I already know? What do I need to know? How can I go and find out the things that I don't already know? And that comes from an integrated engineering curriculum that is based on problem-based learning. So the learning and teaching environment is also different. So we offer an accelerated MEng integrated engineering. That's usually a 4-year qualification in the UK. We offer that in 3 years, and we achieve that basically by having the students with us for longer. So we don't kind of double the work rate that they have to go through. We actually have them working all through the summer period. So they have structured holidays. So it's a very different environment. They have structured holidays, lots of long weekends after every sprint, but also 2 weeks at Easter, summer and Christmas. And we have a learning environment that is structured so that the students are with us 9 to 5. And obviously it's going to be really interesting to see how students actually engage with that pattern and whether we're successful in selecting the students that will thrive in that environment. I think there's some interesting observations for us to make about mental health, whether the students who come into this environment do have a better quality of life without these huge peaks of assessment loading. And so that's a bit of a watch and see. It's something that I think about quite a lot in terms of the student experience. We have a studio pedagogy, so students go into a studio for the duration of a sprint and they do all of their learning in there. So that is their space for the 3.5 weeks that they're on the sprint. It's where they are taught in classes of 25. It's where they're taught concepts, where they work with educators, where they work together on collaborative exercises. They can do some experimentation and demonstration of concepts, do some practical skills. There's also a factory space, but some like soldering can happen in the studios, and they work on their assessment together and individually in that studio environment. And so part of that space design is also about having quiet spaces that are close by, so that if you are just thinking, actually, I really need to concentrate on this, there is somewhere that is less social for you to go to be able to spend a little time in silent study, for example. And so therefore, there's very high levels of social learning, it's very hands-on, and the students are in close proximity to educators. And I think that this is something for us to keep an eye on as we scale up, is that it's important for us to know the students and the students to know us, because it is an intensive program. There's not a lot of room for slippage. And so we need to know that the students are going along with us. And one of the best ways to know that is to know the students at an individual level, so that interventions can be made quite quickly. And so whilst it looks very appealing to double the size of a studio and have 50 students at once from a sort of financial sustainability perspective, you would lose a lot in that individual student awareness. So that's one of the things that I spend quite a lot of time thinking about. And there is a truly continuous assessment. So there are no, we don't have invigilated unseen examinations. We have a wide variety of assessment formats that as closely as possible mimic and replicate and train for the professional environment. So there's all sorts of things from observed debates to lots of questions and answers. So lots of oral assessment actually, but white papers, written reports, specifications, drawings, artifacts, lots of different assessment formats. And initially designed to meet regional needs, not overseas markets. And that's actually quite a radical thing to say in the UK right now. Deep integration of business and community partners, and a lifelong learning offer that spans MSCs, apprenticeships, executive education, and continuing professional development. So I'm not going to talk through all of this. I just wanted to show you the shape of our curriculum, which is basically sprint based. I'm very happy to talk with anybody that wants to talk about this afterwards, but I just thought you might want to know how we actually teach. So basically we have toolboxes that are really key points of fusing liberal arts and engineering. So for example, the very first toolbox that they do over in that top left-hand corner is called certainty. And as well as learning about metrology, students also learn about rhetoric. And so how do you be certain in what you're saying? How do you be contingent in what you're saying? How do you evaluate what somebody else is saying? And so there's some quite novel sort of combinations of liberal arts and engineering sciences so that can be brought together in combined ways of thinking. Then there are 17 engineering sprints, which might be statics or dynamics or electronics or control systems or materials. There are advanced sprints over in cluster G, bottom right-hand corner, which are thematic. So here is where you're drawing across all of your topic areas to say, right, we're going to look at a sprint that, and these are thematic. So health, infrastructure, energy, security. There are community-based challenges in the sort of getting towards the end of month 12, getting towards the end of the first year and towards the end of the second year, that might be, for example, an equestrian riding aid, you know, something that again looks across the different engineering sprints and brings them together into a context. And there are individual projects too. And so in conclusion, to speak to the theme that I was asked to speak to, in what sense is this personal and lifelong? So it is true that within the course that snake, shall I call it a snake? That snake pattern that you just saw, they're all core modules. So there is not a whole portfolio of electives. We're not really big enough to deliver that. We don't want to do that before we're accredited because it adds complexity. Also, we need to make sure that we retain coherence across the pedagogy. But all through that, students are working with professionals on real projects in context. And so there is definitely that sense of lifelong sort of practice orientation happening from day one. Outside those modules that you saw and outside the snake that was on the preceding slide is a whole platform of skills development that is almost completely personalizable. So we don't require maths A-level as an entry requirement, although some students may have that. All of the maths, communication and information technology needs that students will need across the program have been mapped and specified and can be accessed by students through multiple modes and at different times. So some asynchronous digital resources, some group working sessions in the skills centre, individual diagnostic tests throughout the curriculum. But at the institutional level, and I think that this is why we would consider ourselves a personal learning track, is that we believe that we offer something that students can't get anywhere else, and that is a deep business and community integration in engineering from a wide range of partners. So every one of those 17 engineering sprints, 2 community challenges, and 4 thematic advanced sprints have industrially or community-based challenges in them that form the problem. We have an accelerated program, which is quite unusual, offering a working pattern that is close to professional practice and will facilitate and support that, and a rounded understanding of engineering in its context, where engineering science is fused with the liberal arts. And so, yeah, would I like to have some more electives in there? Not if it came at the expense of those liberal arts. You know, we think that we offer something that's quite distinctive, and maybe that's what personalization is actually all about, is a more genuine choice in the offer that our young people and our lifelong learners can get from higher education engineering.
Thank you very much, Bev. So questions. Babby's got his hand up. Controversial way of getting my attention this time. I'll go Babby first, and then I'll bring Emanuela in, who's got a question in the chat.
I thought I'd try a different method, John, just to see if you were awake. Bev, this is very interesting, and I was the founding dean of engineering of a private school in India, BML Munjal, which we launched in fall 2014. So there's an energy in being in a startup, and I can see that. My question is, how do you go about attracting good students and good faculty?
Yeah, so I didn't realize that, so I've not been at NMITE during its development phase. So I came in 3 months ago, and I definitely see myself as an implementer. I've innovated in more established engineering context, and my eye is definitely in about a year's time when we're scaling up and implemented. And so it's really caught me this week, actually, as we've launched. It's like, you know, it becomes a tick box on your to-do list, and then I think, oh my word, we actually don't know who is going to apply. We don't know who we're going to appeal to. We don't know how effective our messages will be. And we're very much in that moment. So we are receiving applications, which is a fantastic news to start with. And I'm conscious this is being recorded and I don't want to say too much, but what is interesting so far is the amount of non-traditional, non-A-level students that are currently in that applicant pool. So it's far too early to say that that is any kind of trend or that's what will be manifest in the pool. And so in terms of the bigger picture about who's going to come to NMITE, ask me in a year's time and then I might know. But what is important is the selection process. So we do have a 3-stage selection process. So we don't have numeracy tests, and we don't have a specific A-level requirement, but students do need to have either a minimum threshold of education in the way that we measure it in the UK, or they need to have a recognition of prior experiential learning. But then there is an application phase that they go through where they have to produce a video, talk about their motivation. We put them, very much like the Olin model actually, we put them in a problem scenario in groups and observe and score how they collaborate, how they deal with disruption in that, and what their sort of value and orientation and approach is. And so the selection process is really important in making sure that we get the kind of students that will thrive in our environment. It's not for everyone, and it doesn't need to be for everyone, because there's lots of other places that learners can go to do, you know, alternative kinds of education. So we need the learners that come to NMITE to be ready to thrive in our environment. Faculty has been really interesting. So we write, so we have a great faculty that come from, some of them come from engineering practice, some of them come from HE, some of them come from overseas HE. Obviously, one of the things that anybody applying to NMITE needs to understand and have is a student orientation. And so that's one of the things that I look for when hiring people is, you know, how do they deal with students? How do they talk about students? What is it? Why is it that they want to come and work with us? But actually getting people to understand that we don't have that overt research mission is really difficult. So you can go all the way through a interview process. And then at the end, somebody will say, can I set up a lab, you know, for X, Y, or Z? And so however hard you try, it can be quite difficult to get people who really understand the mission of the organization. So basically, when we hire faculty and look for faculty, we're looking for people who are passionate about high quality engineering education, are uncomfortable with ambiguity because we are a startup, and can be innovative and actioned within that. And also people who are able to contextualize whatever it is that they know, they can contextualize that into engineering, into challenge type philosophies, and into global problems. And that's kind of the things that we look for when we hire staff. Did that answer your question?
Thanks. Just a comment. The most difficult question I used to get was, will you put your children into your new university?
Well, if my daughter had ever been prepared to go anywhere near an engineering course, I would definitely have done that, but she's quite happy in politics. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that it would have that this course would have suited me very much. I came through an apprenticeship route as when I was training, and I guess that's what attracts me to NMITE, is that, you know, if I came from a different background, I would have gone somewhere else. It's not that that's the only way to do it, but it's a good fit for me because that's how I learn, and so I see and can talk about the value in it.
Can I, actually, it's follow on from your question about the research and the teaching. Can I bring Emanuela in to ask the question?
Let me unmute. Hi, Deb.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
Yeah, great, thanks.
I've not seen you in ages, but we need to catch up. I just wanted to say, I mean, now you've talked about staff, but do you see other pros and cons to having a teaching only institution in the HEI environment in the UK? I know staff is one thing that but you know, and they might be different while you're starting up and when you're established. And I just wonder whether or not you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, and I'll consider myself amongst friends here, and so, you know, kind of talk quite openly about what I think. You know, when I came in to NMITE, we were sort of you know, drawing to the conclusion of the validation process, and one of the things that you get interrogated on is, what's the staff development, what funding do you put in that, what's the structure for that? So you have to have an answer for all of that. And of course there's budget, you know, quite healthy budgets for CPD development, there's a sabbatical program, those kinds of things. And I used to hear that we would say that, you know, actually the process of working with industrial partners will keep staff fresh. And I just thought, I'm not sure I think that that's enough. I don't think that will work in quite the way that it's seen to work. And so when I came in, I wanted to talk to staff about, what are your relationships with other organizations? You know, do you have mentors that are outside NMITE? Who do you work with? How do we get you to be doing more than teaching on this one program? You know, so what's your portfolio of activity? So I think that it is important that people, that our educators are kept fresh. If you ask me to define what fresh means, that's really difficult, right? Because it doesn't necessarily mean research active and knowing about the titanium of, you know, welding titanium or whatever it is. It's actually about knowing what state of the art is, about knowing who the connections are, about being able to be saying, okay, here's where we are now, but here's where we're going, and what does that look like in terms of rolling out, and does that affect how I think about our curriculum, and do I think we need to be going in a slightly different direction? And if we were having those kinds of, or when we have those kinds of conversations, I know that staff are on it. If that's starting to get to the nub of what is actually quite subjective issues. So it is so one of the things that I've also started looking at is the strategic relationships that we have with other universities. You know, we don't live in isolation. We do not need to try and replicate what other people do. We don't want fundamental research activity to take resources away from our educational program, but it's also important that it is an intellectual community. You know, and what I think is, how do I stop this And Peter Goodhue, you will know, is very good at asking me this question, is how do you stop this becoming a FE college in 5 years' time?
Right.
And that's the thing that keeps me going, is thinking about, you know, how do I make sure that we stay at the higher education level? So yeah, it's a really good question, and something that I think we work on as we have new institutions coming online. You know, there's so many new providers now that will be looking at these similar problems, is, you know, how, if you're not going to just follow the path that everybody else follows and then end up offering the same things that everybody else offers, then how do you keep your intellectual community vibrant and alive?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
one final one. There's I guess, clarification here. Is it a general engineering degree, or is there a specificity of discipline at the end? And if it is general, what's the variety of subjects that students cover?
Yeah, so we call it, so it's called an integrated engineering degree rather than a general engineering degree. So you might call it a general engineering degree. We'd call it, so it doesn't have a specialty at the end. So they don't do, you know, 2 years of general and then go into mechanical. It's integrated all the way through. And so so by integrated, we mean it integrates across materials, control, electronics, statics, dynamics, and they sort of progress through the years of the curriculum, but it also integrates liberal arts and subjectivity in there. So and that's why a PBL sort of approach is almost unavoidable in order to be able to do this, because it gives you that deep contextualization again and again and again as students move through the program. If you and so there is obviously a chance to specialize when students move into a very substantial individual project. So they do one smaller sort of practice project at the end of the beginning of the third year, which is at bachelor's level, but then they do a 65 credit project in the final year, which is actually much bigger than a normal undergraduate project that you'd get here. It's kind of a master's degree size project. So it is a very substantial piece of work where a student will be specialising in something.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Bev.